What would you do if the person you thought would never leave finally walks away, and the only thing left to hold on to is regret? This is the story of a marriage pushed to its breaking point, a love lost, and the painful realization that control doesn't equal happiness. Melissa grew up in a quiet suburban neighborhood where her striking beauty quickly became a point of focus. From a young age, she learned the subtle power of charm and how it could open doors for her, a lesson her mother, who always stressed the importance of appearances, reinforced constantly. Despite the emphasis on outward appeal, Melissa harbored dreams of a career in fashion design, inspired by the glossy pages of the magazines scattered across her bedroom. In her first year at university, Melissa's outgoing nature and ambition helped her connect with a group of women who shared her fascination with social climbing. Their friendships, though vibrant, often carried a layer of superficiality. Among this circle, Danielle emerged as both her closest confidant and her fiercest rival, an intricate balance of camaraderie and competition in their pursuit of influence and success. During her junior year, Melissa crossed paths with Ryan at a lively campus party. His effortless charisma and undeniable confidence captivated her instantly, sparking a whirlwind romance that quickly consumed her life. However, Ryan's betrayal, a public and humiliating affair, left Melissa heartbroken and deeply distrustful. The pain fueled a fierce determination within her. She vowed never to let herself be vulnerable again. That summer, not long after the fallout with Ryan, Melissa met Darren. His steady, calm demeanor and genuine interest in her stood in stark contrast to the larger-than-life personalities she had been drawn to before. Though she was hesitant, Melissa's friends encouraged her to give Darren a chance. Cautious but intrigued, she entered the relationship, determined this time to keep the upper hand. By the time they married, Melissa had firmly shaped the dynamic of their relationship to suit her need for control. Darren, eager to please and deeply devoted, often deferred to her preferences, whether it was the home they chose or the social circles they engaged with. While Darren found joy in making her happy, Melissa's lingering insecurities sometimes surfaced as rigid boundaries and moments of harshness, though Darren rarely pushed back. Years into their marriage, Melissa began to notice subtle changes in Darren. The man who had once centered his world entirely around her was now developing new hobbies and forming friendships outside of their life together. At first, she dismissed these changes as harmless, but a growing unease took root within her. It wasn't just his new interests, it was the gnawing fear that her control over their relationship might be slipping. One evening, as this tension brewed quietly beneath the surface, Darren's sharp voice broke the silence. "What took you so long?" he snapped, his tone uncharacteristically impatient. Melissa, descending the staircase cautiously, spotted him holding her purse in one hand, his movements tense and deliberate. His expression, etched with unease, hinted at a conflict that neither of them could continue to ignore. Darren extended the purse to Melissa, his jaw tight as he avoided the amused glances her friends exchanged. Their smirks were thinly concealed, almost daring him to react. Melissa, petite with striking green eyes that had captivated him once, shot him a look of barely masked irritation. She hadn't changed much since college, still slender with an effortless, youthful figure. Her friends, save for Helen, seemed to share her knack for maintaining polished appearances. Helen, on the other hand, stood out with her modest attire, heavier frame, and unbleached dark hair, a stark contrast to the others, who flaunted bold, short skirts and trendy styles. Darren often found himself wondering why Helen spent time with Melissa and her circle or, for that matter, why they allowed her to stay around. She didn't fit the mold. While the rest of the group sipped cocktails or glasses of wine, Helen abstained from drinking altogether. Perhaps she was their unofficial designated driver, that seemed the most plausible explanation to him. Melissa broke his thoughts with her sharp tone. "Honestly, Darren," she said, her voice cutting through the air, "you should be grateful I'm leaving. It gives me a break from this dreary cave." She swept her hand toward the spacious four-bedroom home she had insisted they purchase 5 years ago, a house that had once been her dream but now seemed to represent her discontent. "And," she added pointedly, "it gives you time for your little friends." Just don't let them into my house." Before Darren could respond, Melissa thrust her hand out expectantly. "Now, the money." He hesitated for a moment, his expression unreadable, before reaching into his pocket and pulling out his wallet. Without a second thought, Melissa took all the cash inside, her smirk widening as she glanced at him. "If you're lucky, and I'm not too tired when I get back, maybe you'll get lucky," she teased, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Then, with a mocking laugh that rang out across the room, she added, "That is, unless I meet someone better." Her laugh was echoed by her friends, though Helen remained noticeably silent, her eyes downcast. Darren said nothing, biting back the sting of her words as he watched the group pile into the sleek new Honda he had bought her just weeks earlier. The sound of their laughter followed them as they drove off, leaving him standing in the quiet, empty driveway. Sighing deeply, Darren returned to the house. The silence inside was almost deafening. After tidying up the mess left behind, he gathered tools and auto parts into his Jeep, preparing to head across town. There was a car project he'd been working on, and for now, it seemed like the perfect escape. Meanwhile, in the Honda, the atmosphere shifted. Helen, who had been silent the entire time, finally spoke up. Her voice was calm but firm. "Melissa, why are you so hard on Darren? He must really love you to put up with this." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "Don't you love him?" For a moment, Melissa didn't respond. Her gaze drifted toward the window, watching the streets blur past. Danielle, ever ready to deflect tension, broke the silence with a laugh. "Come on, Helen," she chimed in, brushing off the question. "Melissa's just having fun. Don't make it so serious." But Helen's words lingered, and Melissa's silence was telling. Memories of Ryan, the charming but cruel man who had shattered her in college, flashed through her mind. She remembered their passionate beginning, the romantic dinner he'd surprised her with, and the night they made love under the stars, his promises lingering in the air like the sound of the waves. Days later, she saw him with another girl, his betrayal cutting her to the core. She had been nothing more than a fleeting conquest to him. The humiliation still stung, leaving scars that Darren's unwavering kindness couldn't entirely heal. Even after years of Darren's loyalty, Melissa couldn't help but carry the weight of those memories. They mixed with her doubts, leaving her unsettled despite all that Darren had done for her. After Ryan, she had vowed never to be vulnerable again, shaping her relationships on her own terms. Darren, patient and selfless, never complained, though the balance in their marriage left little room for compromise. Recently, however, things had started to shift. Darren's newfound interest in cars had led him to a fresh circle of friends, including Tim and Elaine Matthews, a couple whose relationship seemed to inspire him. Melissa, initially indifferent, had finally agreed to meet them after Darren's persistent urging. She couldn't deny her curiosity about the people who were beginning to influence her husband in ways she hadn't foreseen. Tim and Elaine lived in a picturesque home with their young daughter, a scene that Melissa found oddly unsettling. It was the kind of life she had never envisioned for herself, yet now, it was becoming a part of Darren's world, a world that felt increasingly separate from her own. While Melissa entertained her friends, Darren drove across town to Tim and Elaine's garage to work on a project. As he arrived, Elaine greeted him warmly at the door, her welcoming smile softening his frayed nerves. "Tim's running late, but you're welcome to get started without him," she offered. Darren hesitated for a moment but decided to stay, touched by their generosity and the effortless kindness they always showed him. Tim and Elaine's relationship fascinated him. Their warmth and mutual respect were palpable, the kind of partnership Darren had always hoped for but had never fully experienced in his own marriage. He admired their dynamic, secretly longing for that same sense of connection with Melissa. Yet Melissa dismissed the Matthews as strange and had outright forbidden Darren from inviting them over, insisting their open and communicative marriage had no place in their home. Her insistence on control was absolute, ensuring the rules of their marriage remained hers to dictate. "Relax," Melissa said later that night, rolling her eyes as Helen fidgeted in her seat at a local open mic event. Sandra always does this, she added dismissively, clearly uninterested in Helen's nervous energy. Not Sandra, Helen replied, nodding toward the stage where a tall woman with long dark hair had taken the microphone. She resembled Helen in coloring, though she was slimmer, with striking features and legs that seemed to command attention. The crowd erupted into boos before the woman even spoke. "I didn't know Jessica was coming tonight," Helen murmured, her voice low and tense. "Who's Jessica?" Melissa asked, glancing at the woman on stage. "My sister," Helen replied flatly, her eyes fixed on the figure as though bracing herself for impact. Meanwhile, Darren had returned home late from the Matthews garage, his mind too heavy with thoughts to seek out Melissa. He admired her peaceful, if distant, form as she slid into bed, but he felt no desire to speak. Melissa, feeling unsettled by his unusual indifference, lay quietly beside him. For a fleeting moment, her thoughts wandered to the Matthews family. She imagined what it might be like to loosen her tight grip on her marriage, to let Darren have the life he seemed to crave. The idea stirred an unexpected vulnerability within her. For the first time, Melissa considered something she had long dismissed, stopping her birth control and letting Darren father a child. The thought was brief, a flicker of warmth that softened her defenses for only a moment. Glancing at Darren, who clutched his pillow in sleep, she thought, "He really must love me." Her eyes stung with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. Vulnerability wasn't an option, not for her. Not ever. The next day, Darren's growing frustrations bubbled closer to the surface. Melissa's behavior the previous evening, her casual cruelty and indifference, had pushed him to his limit. For months, he had ignored the gnawing suspicion that she no longer respected him, let alone loved him. But last night had been different. He was now convinced that Melissa was unfaithful. The emotional distance, the mocking comments, it all seemed too calculated, too cruel. Darren reached a breaking point. He picked up the phone and called Ryan, an old friend and a divorce lawyer he hadn't spoken to in years. Ryan answered on the third ring, his voice warm but cautious. As Darren explained the situation, detailing the years of tension, the doubts, and his growing unhappiness, Ryan listened patiently. "I can't say I'm surprised," Ryan finally said when Darren paused. "Honestly, I'm shocked it took you this long. If we handle this correctly, we can get you out of this with your dignity intact." Darren's voice cracked slightly. "I don't have any proof she's cheated," he admitted, his frustration seeping through. "But I can't live like this anymore, Ryan. I can't keep being the only one trying." Ryan's tone turned professional but compassionate. "Then we'll take the first steps. Proof or no proof, you deserve better than this." Hanging up the phone, Darren felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. He didn't want to end his marriage, but he also couldn't endure the constant humiliation and neglect. Melissa had been waiting all day for his attention, crafting subtle provocations to draw him in, expecting him to notice her and plead for intimacy. Instead, Darren kept his distance, retreating to his office to research car paint options, a hobby that had become his sanctuary. Melissa's plan to reignite his interest was failing miserably. She watched him from across the room, frustration boiling under her carefully composed expression. "Darren," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the silence. He didn't respond, his indifference feeling like a slap to her ego. What's wrong with him? Melissa wondered to herself. Instead of the desire she had expected to see in his eyes, his gaze seemed weighed down by something darker, an unmistakable sadness mixed with quiet resentment. For the first time in years, Melissa felt truly unsure of where they stood. And for Darren, the realization hit harder than ever, being alone had to be better than living like this. "Darren!" Melissa screamed from the living room, her voice sharp and grating. "When did you get home? And why didn't you tell me you were back?" Darren appeared in the doorway, calm and composed, a sharp contrast to her agitation. Melissa's demand hung in the air, but he didn't rush to explain himself. Her anger fizzled slightly as she studied his detached expression. It struck her in that moment, the man who once bent over backward for her now seemed unreachable. There had been a time when she could count on his unwavering attention, but now he seemed different. And it terrified her. Melissa had always thought she controlled their relationship, yet lately, she had begun to sense that something vital was slipping away. For the first time, she admitted to herself that she didn't know how to bridge the growing gap in their marriage, or even where to begin. "You need to ease up on Darren," Helen said gently later that evening as they sat in the kitchen, sipping tea. "Stop trying to control everything. If you don't, you're going to lose him. And trust me, Melissa, you don't want to end up like Danielle, alone and bitter." Melissa's face hardened, but she said nothing. Helen's words struck a nerve, even though she hated admitting it. She had never stopped to think about what it might feel like if Darren truly walked away from her. What would she have left? For a moment, she wondered if Helen might be right, if it was time to change. But before she could process the thought further, the sound of the doorbell interrupted them. Darren emerged from his office as Melissa opened the door. Danielle stood there, looking distraught. "Remember when you told her to leave your house?" Melissa quipped, arching an eyebrow at Darren. "That's not what I meant." Danielle snapped, brushing past them into the living room. Sandra followed, looking equally exasperated. "Her ex's new wife is pregnant again," Sandra chimed in, "and they named the baby after Danielle's mom." "Oh, and guess what? Danielle's mom is the godmother. She's been rubbing it in her face non-stop. That's why she's upset." Melissa spent the next hour listening to Danielle rant about her ex-husband, who had moved on and built a happy life. She lamented the fact that she no longer had any control over him, a sentiment that made Melissa uncomfortable. For years, she'd prided herself on having the upper hand in her relationship with Darren. But was control worth it if it came at the expense of connection? As Danielle's voice droned on, Melissa caught Darren's name slipping into the conversation. "It's such a shame," Sandra murmured sympathetically. "Darren's such a good man. Melissa doesn't even see it." The comment stung, but Melissa pretended not to hear. Meanwhile, Darren had found himself in a different atmosphere entirely. Across town, he was spending the evening with Jessica and a group of her friends. Jessica, whose striking features and easy smile had intrigued him, welcomed him into their cozy gathering. They were sitting in her small living room, sharing stories and strumming guitars. "Mind if I stay and listen?" Darren asked after hearing about their impromptu songwriting session. "Of course," Jessica said, her smile warm and inviting. The evening carried an almost magical feel. Jessica sang a few familiar songs before the group began experimenting with original material. Darren found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years. The conversation flowed effortlessly, transitioning from music to stories about their lives and past relationships. Jessica eventually confided in Darren about her failed marriage, revealing how her ex-husband, despite having a beautiful wife, couldn't resist the attention of his fans. As Jessica spoke, Darren felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, a genuine connection. She seemed to see him in a way Melissa never had. By the time Darren returned home near midnight, he was still caught up in the quiet warmth of the evening. Melissa was waiting for him on the couch, dressed in a nearly transparent nightgown clearly meant to provoke a reaction. "Where the hell have you been?" she demanded, her tone sharp and accusatory. "I was checking on my car's paint job," Darren replied evenly. "I got caught up talking." He didn't elaborate, and the calmness of his voice only made Melissa angrier. Melissa's frustration boiled over the next evening when Darren came home early, changed quickly, and headed toward the door again. "Where do you think you're going?" she demanded, blocking his way. "I didn't give you permission." Darren turned to face her, his expression calm but resolute. "I don't need your permission, Melissa. You don't tell me where you're going, so why should I have to answer to you? What's wrong with you?" Melissa shouted, her voice trembling with frustration. For 10 years, you've never once listened to a word you've said? Darren interrupted, his voice rising for the first time in years. Because for 10 years, all I've ever done is listen to you. But now I'm done, Melissa. I'm done living my life like this. Melissa stood frozen as Darren walked past her and out the door. For the first time, she realized that the control she had clung to so fiercely might have driven him away for good. I loved you, Darren said firmly, his voice steady yet filled with a quiet ache. I hoped you'd stop punishing me for things I didn't do. But I can't keep living like this. Without waiting for a response, he walked out of the room, his words lingering in the silence he left behind. That evening, Darren found himself at Tim and Elaine's backyard gathering, joined by Jessica, whose easy laughter lightened the mood. As the night deepened, the group moved outside, sitting on the cool grass to watch fireworks. Darren couldn't help but notice the way Tim and Elaine leaned into each other, their young daughter fast asleep on their shared lap. The warmth and intimacy between them painted a picture of happiness that felt both comforting and painfully out of reach. Jealous? Jessica asked softly, her gaze following his. Very, Darren admitted, his voice quiet but honest. Me too, she replied, barely above a whisper. For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. In the days that followed, Darren and Jessica didn't see each other. Darren, inspired by the evening, threw himself into finishing a song he'd been working on. Music became his refuge, a way to process the whirlwind of emotions he had been feeling. Meanwhile, Melissa's attempts to draw Darren's attention only pushed him further away. One night, Melissa wore a dress she had once used to captivate him, hoping it might reignite something between them. As Darren walked past her without a second glance, she stopped him with a sharp question. Do you even care anymore? She snapped. Darren paused briefly, then replied with quiet resignation, use a rubber or don't, it's not like it matters, considering we haven't had intimacy in ages. Without waiting for her reaction, he left, softly humming the melody of his song. Melissa stood frozen, stunned. She had worn the dress hoping he would ask her to stay, but instead, she was left feeling emptier than ever. At Jessica's garage a few nights later, Darren arrived to find her waiting with a bright smile. Come on, she said playfully, taking his hand. You have to see this. Covering his eyes, she led him into the paint booth where his convertible, freshly painted, gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Tada, she exclaimed, stepping back to let him take it in. Frustrated by their height difference as she tried to get a better view, Darren laughed and scooped her up effortlessly, holding her at eye level with the car. Are you nervous? Jessica teased, grinning down at him. A little, Darren admitted, though his smile betrayed his excitement. Later, as they sat in the garage, Darren played his guitar, the chords filling the space with a raw, soulful energy. Jessica listened intently, humming along as she read the lyrics. By the time they finished, her expression was a mix of inspiration and unease. This is incredible, she said softly, her voice full of admiration. But it's also terrifying. It feels real. That evening, Jessica arranged a rehearsal with her band to test Darren's song. Beforehand, Darren took her for a drive in his convertible, the warm night air wrapping around them like a soothing balm. For the first time in years, Darren felt truly at ease. It was as if a weight had been lifted, and he could finally breathe again. When Darren returned home that night, he didn't stop to engage with Melissa, who was waiting on the couch. The next morning, he made a decision. He called his secretary to request a few days off and then reached out to Ryan, asking him to finalize the divorce papers. Ryan assured Darren that the settlement would be fair but firm, protecting Darren's financial security while leaving Melissa with enough to rebuild her life. Melissa woke that morning with a pounding headache and a gnawing sense of sadness she couldn't shake. She blamed it on the booze from the previous night, but deep down, she knew better. There was a deeper loss, a realization that she had pushed Darren away in her attempt to protect herself. Now, she feared it might be too late to undo the damage. Determined to make amends, Melissa called Helen for advice. When Helen arrived, she took one look at Melissa and didn't mince words. "You look awful," she said bluntly. "Thanks for the vote of confidence," Melissa replied sarcastically, though her voice lacked its usual bite. Helen crossed her arms, her expression serious. "You never listen to me, Melissa. But let me ask you this, who are you going to find better than Darren?" Melissa stared at her, confused and defensive. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked. Helen sighed deeply, her tone softening. "I've seen this before. You're heading down the same path I did. I was wild when I was younger, and my husband, George, put up with a lot. But one night, I went too far. I thought he'd never leave me, but he did. And you know what? It broke me, Melissa. It's only a matter of time before Darren reaches his breaking point too, if he hasn't already." Melissa swallowed hard, Helen's words settling heavily in her chest. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider what life would look like without Darren. And for the first time, she felt truly afraid. Melissa's chest tightened as Helen's words grew more desperate, each one striking a nerve she couldn't ignore. "Real control in a marriage," Helen said firmly, "comes from giving it up. Darren loves you, but if you keep this up, Melissa, you'll lose him for good. Look at Danielle, bitter, sleeping with random men while her ex has built a happy life, or Sandra, dating anyone who'll have her just to avoid being alone. Is that what you want?" Melissa's instinct was to push back, to dismiss Helen's warnings as overblown. But deep down, she felt the truth in her friend's words. Still, her pride refused to let her fully concede. "Helen," she said, her voice carefully measured, "thank you for your advice. But Darren and we still have a chance. I'm going to see him today." Helen raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "Just think about what I said," she replied, handing Melissa a glass of something she had prepared. "Here, drink this, it'll help with the hangover." While Melissa wrestled with her emotions, Darren was with Jessica, sitting in her band's rehearsal space. They were perfecting their rendition of his song, and Darren couldn't help but feel a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Watching Jessica sing, her smile radiant and her enthusiasm infectious, Darren felt himself drawn to her light. Her laughter wasn't forced, her joy was real. It was a sharp contrast to the tension that had defined his life with Melissa for so long. "Can we run the chorus again?" Jessica asked, her eyes sparkling with determination. "I want it to be perfect." Darren nodded, strumming the opening chords once more. He knew he couldn't focus on anything else, not work, not the unresolved chaos of his marriage, when emotions swirled so intensely inside him. This performance wasn't just a creative outlet, it symbolized something far more profound. It was the end of one chapter and the start of another. Jessica had suggested performing the song at the very club where they had first connected, a poetic way to mark this transition. For Darren, it felt like closure, a chance to finally shed the weight of the emotional turbulence he had endured for years. Meanwhile, Melissa sat in a waiting room, gripping her phone tightly. She had been calling Jessica all day, desperate to track down Darren. Finally, Jessica answered. "Hey, Helen," Jessica greeted casually, mistaking the caller. "It's me," Melissa said, her voice edged with tension. "Do you know where Darren is?" Jessica hesitated but decided to be honest. "He's here, rehearsing with us." Melissa's stomach twisted. She felt both fury and fear creeping up her spine. She had always justified her treatment of Darren as self-defense, a way to guard herself against the heartbreak she had experienced in college. But as she sat there, she realized those excuses were growing thin. "Melissa," a voice interrupted her spiraling thoughts. It was Agatha, her therapist, gently guiding her back to reality. "Was Darren the one who hurt you back then?" Melissa's expression darkened. No. It was Ryan, she admitted, her voice taut. And your behavior now, Agatha continued, her tone calm but probing, part of it is a defense mechanism, isn't it? To keep that pain from happening again? I guess so, Melissa muttered, her eyes fixed on the floor. Is it also about revenge? Agatha asked pointedly. For the humiliation you felt back then? Melissa hesitated, her voice quieter now. Maybe. Agatha's questions lingered in Melissa's mind as she and Helen arrived at the club later that evening. Her emotions were a chaotic storm of regret and desperation. She wasn't ready to let Darren go, not yet. Inside, Melissa spotted Darren on stage. The song he was performing struck a nerve. It was raw, heartfelt, a reflection of the pain and struggles he had endured in their marriage. Melissa realized, with a sinking feeling, that it wasn't just a performance. It was a statement. A declaration of everything he had carried, alone, for so long. As the song ended, the crowd erupted into applause. Melissa stood frozen, overwhelmed. Next to her, Helen turned to her with a knowing look. Frankly, Helen said softly, I hope Darren does leave you. Maybe then you'll finally understand. Melissa's temper flared. She stormed out of the club, her frustration spilling over as she saw Helen waiting for her outside. That so-called therapist doesn't know what she's talking about, Melissa spat. She actually thinks I'm the problem. Helen sighed deeply, her patience wearing thin. Melissa, do you remember what I said? You need to show Darren you care. You need to make him happy. Melissa scoffed. He was always happy, at least until recently. No, Helen said firmly, her tone cutting through Melissa's defenses. He might have loved you, but he wasn't happy with the way you treated him. Be honest with yourself. Why do you even want him to stay? Before Melissa could answer, Sandra joined them, her own announcement adding to the evening's tension. By the way, Sandra said lightly, tonight's my last night at the club. I've met someone, and I'm ready to move on from this scene. Danielle rolled her eyes. You're letting some guy control you, she scoffed. Sandra shrugged with a small smile. Absolutely. For Melissa, the irony of the moment wasn't lost. Everywhere she turned, people were moving forward. And yet, here she was, still clinging to a life she no longer knew how to salvage. Sandra's face softened as she replied, he makes me feel amazing. If you weren't so bitter about your ex, you might understand what it feels like to let go and just, be loved. Danielle snorted, crossing her arms defiantly. I'll always be in control. That's all that matters. Shaking her head, Sandra gave a small, sad smile. Control won't keep you warm at night, Danielle. It won't tell you it loves you when you're feeling insecure. You keep holding on to it, and you'll grow old angry and alone. Before Danielle could respond, the low rumble of engines turned heads. A convoy of yellow Mustangs pulled into the lot, led by a striking convertible. Melissa's stomach sank as she caught sight of Jessica in the passenger seat, her wild hair flowing in the wind. Darren, sitting behind the wheel, parked the car, stepped out, and, without so much as a glance in Melissa's direction, opened the door for Jessica. Escorting her through a side entrance, he looked calm and focused, a man who had moved on. Inside the club, it was standing room only. Melissa followed her friends in, her nerves taut. With no tables available, they spotted a man Danielle knew sitting alone and joined him. Danielle wasted no time, quickly leaving the group to dance with the man, but Melissa remained seated, uneasy and out of place. Backstage, Darren was preparing for his big moment. Jessica hovered nearby, offering encouragement. You're doing great, she said with a reassuring smile as Darren adjusted his guitar strap. His excitement was palpable, though the night's significance weighed on him. What's going on? Melissa asked Elaine, who had just joined her at the table. Her curiosity was piqued, though she struggled to mask her unease. It's a big night for Darren, Elaine explained. This is his first time performing in public. And there are record label reps here tonight. He's got a lot riding on this. Melissa's face tightened. She glanced toward the stage, her chest nodding. Elaine noticed and leaned in gently. Maybe you still have a chance, she said softly. You're here, which means you care. That's something. Melissa nodded slowly, her resolve hardening. She wasn't ready to give up, at least, not yet. The club's atmosphere shifted as the stage lights dimmed. The crowd buzzed with anticipation. A single spotlight illuminated Darren, standing alone with his guitar. Melissa's jaw clenched as women near the stage whistled and cheered, their admiration blatant. How dare they whistle at my husband? She thought bitterly, jealousy coiling tightly in her chest. The first chords of the song echoed through the room, raw and haunting. Darren's voice was steady yet filled with emotion, every lyric a reflection of his bottled frustrations. Melissa felt the weight of his words, a stark reminder of how much pressure he had endured before finally breaking. As Jessica joined in for the second verse, her voice cut through the tension, effortlessly commanding the room. Then, unexpectedly, Jessica descended into the audience, holding the microphone as she wove through the crowd. Her gaze locked onto Melissa, and the room seemed to freeze. Reaching Melissa, she handed her a folded set of papers without breaking stride. Then she returned to the stage, picking up the chorus just in time for the packed club to sing along, making the moment feel almost surreal. Melissa stared at the papers in her hands, her heart pounding. Unfolding them with trembling fingers, she felt the air leave her lungs. They were divorce papers. Tears streamed down her face as Helen's warnings echoed in her mind, if you don't change, Darren will leave you, and by the time you realize what you had, it'll be too late. Melissa's mind screamed in defiance. Not with my husband. Not with Darren. But as the reality sank in, so did the finality of his decision. The night ended in heartbreak for Melissa, but for Darren, it was transformative. His performance marked a turning point, both professionally and personally. 3 months later, Darren proposed to Jessica, and she accepted. He bought out Melissa's share of their home, ensuring she had enough to get back on her feet. Melissa, meanwhile, spiraled into despair. Everywhere she went, she heard Darren's song, on the radio, in stores, even on TV. The song's raw vulnerability resonated with audiences, propelling Darren's band into unexpected success. For Melissa, it was a constant reminder of what she had lost. As her settlement money dwindled, Melissa took a job as a waitress to stay afloat. The work was grueling, but it was the only option she had left. Often, she found herself riding the bus back to her old neighborhood, unable to resist the pull of familiarity. From a distance, she would watch Darren and Jessica playing with their 2 young children in the yard of the home that used to be hers. Each visit left her in tears, yet she couldn't bring herself to stop. In those quiet, painful moments, Melissa clung to a futile hope that Darren might someday forgive her. But deep down, she knew the truth, Darren had moved on. And for Melissa, the life she had taken for granted was now nothing more than a distant, painful memory.